Welcome to my channel of Gill Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. What happens when a black judge and the white man he sentenced are locked in the same jail cell overnight? A clash of worlds ignites. A conversation that neither of them saw coming. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom buzzed faintly as Judge Harold Davis leaned back in his leather chair. At 57, he had seen the faces of every kind of defendant pass before him, some defiant, some remorseful, most a mix of both. But the face of Tom Richards still lingered in his mind. Tom was a man in his early 30s, with rough hands and a chip on his shoulder. His assault case had been straightforward, the sentence even more so: 3 months in county jail. Fair but firm. Davis's signature approached that morning as he sipped his coffee and reviewed the docket for the day. Harold couldn't have known how wildly the scales of justice were about to tilt. By evening, he wouldn't be the man sitting behind the bench, but the one standing behind bars. It started with a knock on his door, loud and insistent, the kind that immediately makes your chest tighten. 2 officers, young and stern-faced, stood in the doorway of his modest home in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Their words were clipped: Judge Davis, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice. Harold's brow furrowed. Obstruction of justice him? He calmly asked for details, but the officers had little to offer beyond a case number and the barest accusation. Something about interfering with a witness. His repeated assurances that it must be a mistake were met with cold indifference. Protocol was protocol, they said. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, heavy and foreign. Harold felt a mix of embarrassment and disbelief as he was led to the squad car, the neighbors' curtains twitching with curiosity. The drive to the station was suffocatingly silent. Harold's mind raced, passing through the hundreds of cases he had presided over. He couldn't recall a single instance that could justify this, but before he could connect the dots, the station loomed ahead, its flickering sign casting a dim glow over the lot. As the booking process began, Harold felt a strange, gnawing discomfort, a sense of being stripped of everything that had defined him: his title, his authority, even his tie. The officers handled him with professional detachment, as if he were just another name on a clipboard. But the whispers from other officers watching him said otherwise. A judge in here. By the time Harold was placed in a holding cell, the reality of the situation hit him like a gut punch. And it wasn't just any cell. He glanced across the dimly lit room and saw a familiar figure slouched on the bench, a man with rough hands and a chip on his shoulder. It was Tom Richards. You've got to be kidding me. Tom muttered, his voice laced with venom. Harold's lips pressed into a tight line, the irony of the moment sinking in. Tom Richards sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as they locked on to Judge Davis. His expression flickered between disbelief and fury, the kind of look that came from seeing the man who had signed away your freedom, now sharing the same fate. Well, Tom said, his voice dripping with mockery. What's the mighty judge doing in a place like this? Can't imagine. It's a social visit. Judge Davis ignored the jab, his mind still churning over the bizarre circumstances of his arrest. He sat on the opposite bench, his back straight, his demeanor calm. He wasn't about to show weakness, especially not here, but inside. His thoughts churned. How had this happened? Who had accused him? The possibility of being set up gnawed at the edges of his mind. After all, being a judge didn't make him immune to enemies. Tom wasn't done. You got anything to say, Your Honor, or is that just for the courtroom? Harold met his gaze, his voice even but firm. I don't owe you an explanation, Mr. Richards, Tom smirked, leaning back against the cold cinder block wall. Fair enough, but don't think for a second I'm not enjoying the hell out of this. The tension in the cell was thick, enough to cut with a knife. Harold had faced hostility before, but it was different here. The walls of the courthouse were designed to shield him, to reinforce his authority. Here in this cell, the dynamic was reversed. He was just another man in an orange jumpsuit, stripped of his title and the respect it commanded. Hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. The only sounds were the occasional shuffle of feet and the muffled hum of voices from outside the cell. Tom alternated between glaring at Harold and mumbling to himself. Harold stayed silent, his mind replaying the officer's curt words, obstruction of justice at some point. The door to the cell block opened, and a guard stepped in. Davis. "You've got a call." Harold stood, his composure intact, despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. The phone was on the far wall, its cord stretched taut as he picked it up. On the other end was his attorney, a longtime colleague who spoke quickly and urgently. "Harold, we're working on it. But this is messy. There's a witness claiming you tried to sway their testimony in the Peterson case." Harold's grip on the phone tightened. The Peterson case had been a high-profile murder trial, one where emotions ran high and threats weren't uncommon. "That's absurd," he said. "I've never even spoken to the witnesses. Outside of court, we know that." His attorney replied, "But proving it's another matter. Someone's out to smear you, Harold. Sit tight, we'll get this sorted." As he hung up the phone, Harold's jaw clenched. He returned to the cell, his face betraying nothing but his mind now sharper, his resolve stronger. Someone had orchestrated this, and he was going to find out who. Tom watched him closely as he re-entered. "Bad news?" he asked with a smirk. Harold sat down, his gaze steady. "Nothing I can't handle." Tom laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Yeah, keep telling yourself that. This place has a way of humbling even the toughest guys." Harold didn't reply. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a judge who had spent decades handing down justice, now at the mercy of a system he had always believed in. The night stretched on the weight of his circumstances, pressing down like a heavy stone as the air in the cell thickened. Both men knew this was only the beginning of their uneasy confrontation. Tom's smirk lingered, a mixture of amusement and contempt. As he studied Judge Davis, the room was thick with tension, unspoken words hanging in the air, like a storm about to break. For Tom, this was poetic justice. The man who had decided his fate was now living, even if just for a night, the life he had condemned others to. "Funny, isn't it?" Tom finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You in here with me makes you wonder, doesn't it? Maybe you ain't as different as you like to think." Harold glanced over, his expression impassive. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Tom leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I mean you're no better than the rest of us. Just a man who made the wrong call. Only difference is, you wear a fancy robe while you do it." Harold sighed, his patience already fraying. "You think sentencing you was a wrong call? You assaulted someone, Mr. Richards. Actions have consequences. Consequences." Tom's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. "You don't know a damn thing about me, about why I did what I did. All you know is what they tell you in that courtroom. You sit up there looking down on us, like you're God or something." Harold met his glare unflinching. "And what would you have me do? Let every sob story sway my judgment? Justice isn't about emotions, it's about facts." Tom stood abruptly, pacing the small cell. "Facts," he muttered, shaking his head. "You love that word, don't you? Facts, like they're the whole story. But you don't see the other side. You don't see the crap people go through before they end up in front of you." Harold's gaze softened, but only slightly. "And what is it I don't see? Tom, enlighten me." Tom stopped pacing, turning to face him. "You don't see desperation. You don't see what it's like to work your ass off and still come up short. To have everything stacked against you from the start. You think I wanted to end up in that courtroom? You think I woke up one day and decided, hey, let's ruin my life?" Harold leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was calm but firm. "And you think you're the only one who struggled? Do you have any idea what it took for me to get where I am? The battles I had to fight just to be seen as worthy of wearing that robe?" Tom hesitated, caught off guard by the judge's tone. "You struggled? Give me a break." Harold's jaw tightened. "Yes. Me growing up in a neighborhood where success was measured by survival. Being told at every turn that I didn't belong, that I couldn't make it because of who I was. I've seen desperation, Tom. I've lived it. The difference is I didn't let it define me." The cell fell silent, both men staring at each other. For a moment, it seemed like the conversation might end there. A stalemate of hardened perspectives. But Tom wasn't ready to let it go, so what he said finally. His voice quieter but still sharp, "You think that gives you the right to sit in judgment of people like me?" Harold's eyes met his steady and unyielding. "It gives me the responsibility. And that's a weight I carry every single day." Tom scoffed, shaking his head as he sat back down. "Responsibility," he muttered, "must be nice. To think you're always doing the right thing." Harold didn't reply. Instead, he leaned back against the wall. Letting the words settle between them, he knew this wasn't a conversation that could be resolved in a single night. Or maybe ever, but he also knew it wasn't over yet, as the minutes ticked by. The uneasy silence between them hinted at deeper truths. Waiting to surface, the silence in the cell was heavy, broken only by the distant clang of metal doors and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Tom tapped his fingers against his knee, his agitation bubbling just beneath the surface. "You know what your problem is," he finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You think you're above all this, like you're immune to making mistakes." Harold turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "And you think this situation makes us equals?" Tom smirked bitterly. "Not equals, but it sure brings you down a peg." Harold chuckled dryly, surprising Tom. "You think this is my first experience with injustice? You think I don't know what it's like to be treated unfairly because of someone else's assumptions?" Tom raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "Oh, here we go. The race card, right? I was wondering when that would come up." Harold's face hardened, but his voice remained measured. "This isn't a card game, Tom. This is reality, and whether you like it or not, race plays a role in how justice is served or denied. In this country." Tom leaned back, shaking his head. "Always about race with you people." Harold's tone sharpened, cutting through Tom's words. "You people, do you even hear yourself? That right there, that's the problem. You walk around thinking the system is broken, only when it doesn't work in your favor. But for people like me, it's been broken from the start." Tom's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Harold pressed on, his voice rising with conviction. "Do you know how many times I've had to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good? How many nights I stayed up studying, knowing one mistake could cost me everything? You sit there blaming me for your choices, but you have no idea the sacrifices I've made to get here." Tom shot to his feet, his frustration boiling over. "Sacrifices? Don't talk to me about sacrifices. I've lost everything, my job, my family gone. You don't know what it's like to be knocked down over and over again, until you don't even want to get back up." Harold stood too, his towering presence filling the small cell. "You're right, Tom. I don't know your exact struggles, but I do know this: blaming others for your failures won't change a damn thing. You have a choice: take responsibility, or stay stuck in this cycle of anger and self-pity." Tom stared at him, his chest rising and falling. With the effort to contain his emotions, for a moment the two men stood there, their opposing worlds colliding in the charged air. Then Tom turned away, his hands gripping the metal bars of the cell. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "You just don't get it." Harold sat back down, his tone softening but still firm. "Then help me understand. Because all I see right now is a man who's given up." Tom didn't respond immediately. His grip on the bars tightened, his knuckles white. Finally, he turned around, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, pain, vulnerability. "You want to understand," he said, his voice trembling. "Fine. Let me tell you about the night I ended up in your courtroom." As the words hung in the air, the walls of hostility began to crack, revealing the raw, unspoken truths underneath. Tom hesitated, as if weighing whether to share the story at all. Finally, he exhaled deeply and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His voice, quieter now, carried a different weight. "It was my daughter's birthday." He began, staring at the floor. "She turned 7 that day. I was supposed to pick her up from my ex-wife's place and take her out for pizza, her favorite, but when I got there, her mother slammed the door in my face, said I wasn't fit to be around our kid, because I didn't have a steady job anymore, because I couldn't keep my temper in check. Tom rubbed a hand over his face, his voice cracking slightly. She wasn't wrong about the temper. I have always had a short fuse. And that night it got the better of me. Some guy at the bar made a comment, something stupid, about me not being man enough to hold on to my family, and I just lost it. Next thing I know, the cops are pulling me off him. Harold listened silently, his expression unreadable but attentive. Tom let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, and now, my daughter probably thinks I'm some kind of monster. Her mom's got plenty of stories to back that up. Harold's voice, when he finally spoke, was low but firm. Your actions don't define you forever, Tom, but they do leave marks. What matters is what you do next. Tom scoffed, but it lacked the bite it had earlier. Easy for you to say you got your life together. A career, respect, all of it, people look up to you. Me, I'm just the guy people cross the street to avoid. Harold's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly. Do you know how many times I've been that guy? How many times people have crossed the street to avoid me, just because of what they thought they knew about me? Tom looked up surprised. Harold continued, his voice steady. When I was your daughter's age, my father worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. We lived in a neighborhood where walking to school was a risk. I got jumped once just for carrying my school books. The guy who did it said I was acting better than everyone else. You learn early on that people will judge you for things you can't control. Tom frowned, his earlier defensiveness slipping away. So how'd you get past it? How'd you make it? Harold paused, choosing his words carefully. I didn't let their judgment define me. I decided that no matter what they thought, I'd prove them wrong, not for their sake, but for mine. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to give up, but every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the people counting on me. My parents, my little brother, my community. Tom tilted his head, curiosity replacing the hostility in his eyes. And now you're here, a judge, but you still ended up in this cell. Harold gave a small, humorless smile. Life has a way of humbling all of us, Tom. No matter how far you climb, there's always someone who wants to pull you down. The key is not letting them win. Tom leaned back against the wall, his face a mixture of contemplation and regret. You really believe I can turn it around? After everything? Harold nodded, his voice firm. I don't just believe it, I've seen it. I've seen men worse off than you rebuild their lives, but it starts with a choice, Tom. A choice to let go of the excuses and take control of your story. The room fell into a heavy silence, but it was no longer the tense, combative kind. Instead, it carried the weight of possibility, of change as the first rays of dawn crept through the barred windows both men sat in, thoughtful, quiet, the barriers between them now replaced by a fragile understanding. The faint light of dawn seeped through the small, high window in the cell, casting long shadows across the walls. Neither man had slept, but the tension that had filled the room earlier had softened into something quieter, almost reflective. Tom broke the silence first. You know, I've spent the last 2 months hating you. Every time I thought about you, I blamed you for everything that went wrong. For me losing my daughter, for me sitting in this place. But now I don't know. He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Maybe it wasn't all you, maybe I played a bigger part in this mess than I wanted to admit. Harold nodded slowly, acknowledging that is the first step. Taking responsibility doesn't mean excusing what happened to you. It means deciding how you move forward. Tom let out a heavy sigh, leaning his head back against the wall. And what does moving forward even look like, you think? My kid's gonna want anything to do with me after this. Harold's voice softened. Kids are more forgiving than we give them credit for. But it starts with showing her you're willing to change. Not with words, but with actions. She doesn't need a perfect father, Tom. She needs an honest one. Tom closed his eyes, the weight of Harold's words sinking in. Maybe you're right, maybe it's not too late. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the early morning filling the space. Then Tom asked almost hesitantly, "What about you? What happens when you get out of here?" Harold's face tightened, the reality of his own situation looming. "I'll fight this, whatever lies brought me here. I'll expose them, but this experience, it's a reminder that even when you're on the right side of the law, you're not always safe from its flaws." Tom frowned. "You really believe in the system, don't you, even after this?" Harold thought for a long moment before answering. "I believe in the idea of justice, even if the system doesn't always get it right. And I believe in the people who fight to make it better. That's why I do what I do." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Guess I never thought about it that way. Maybe the system isn't just about punishment, maybe it's about second chances too." Harold offered a faint smile. "It can be if you let it." The sound of keys jingling outside the cell broke. The moment a guard appeared, unlocking the door. "Davis, you're being released, your lawyer's here." Harold stood smoothing his jumpsuit before stepping out. He turned to Tom. "What do you do next is up to you, Tom. Don't waste it." Tom gave a small nod, his voice low. "Thanks, Judge." Harold stepped out of the cell, the weight of the night heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve stronger than ever. As he walked down the hallway, he glanced back one last time, seeing Tom sitting quietly, deep in thought. By the time Harold exited the station, the sun was rising, fully casting the city in warm light. His lawyer was waiting, but his mind lingered on the man he had just left behind. For all their differences, they had shared something undeniable, a moment of humanity, raw and unfiltered. Harold knew his battle wasn't over. Clearing his name would be a long, uphill fight, but he also knew this: change starts with understanding, and sometimes the smallest encounters can leave the deepest impact. This story reminds us that growth often begins in the most unexpected places. It's never too late to take responsibility, make amends, and strive for a better future. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and redemption. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of Gill Master Stories community. See you soon.